look very slim there. I'm actually very fat in real life. I'd like to say one thing. I've been duped because Rob told me to talk about anything except what I do. And I've noticed everybody else has spoken about what they do. So I'm going to talk about budgerigar breeding for a bit now. Yeah, so the problem I had with public art, I used to be a magazine art director a long time ago. I'm very used to talking about magazine art direction. But for the last 15 years, I've been represented as an artist by galleries. For the last 8 years, I've had a problem with public art. I've got lots of problems. This is just one of them I can share with you. Let me move that. That's just the way. I made it worse. Okay, I'm just going to get on with it. All right. So the problem I had with public art. Essentially is a very particular strain of art, public art, and really it's about the confusion between art and architecture, and really about the deployment of gigantically oversized public art. I could go now. That's the problem I have with public art. In a way, it began with this. Lots of things that I'm going to talk about began with this man. It began in 1896 with this man called Edward Watkins. I mean, Edward Watkins was an enormously wealthy industrialist. He owned what became the Metropolitan Line. He wanted to build the first Channel Tunnel. He also wanted to build a tower in Wembley, which was going to be called the Great Tower of London, to rival the Eiffel Tower in Paris, to make actually a bigger tower. This is a time, of course, of great, enormously competitive engineering projects. So Mr. Watkins planned to build a 1,200-foot tall tower in Wembley, where the Wembley Stadium is. So he opened up a competition, and people from around the world, about 70 people from around the world entered this competition to build Watkins Tower. There were incredibly insane examples of things. I mean, this is a kind of Taj Mahal one, but one of them was a copy of one of the great pyramids, inverted, upside down, with vegetarians in it. This was the proposal. It would be a pyramid with vegetarians in it, and they'd be self-sufficient. They'd have hanging gardens, and they'd feed themselves. And it was called the aerial vegetarians. So that was one of the that one didn't win, obviously. There are all sorts of things. One had a train track going around it, 1,000 foot into the air. There was absolutely insane things. But the reason I'm showing you all this is because it actually ended here. It ended up being called the London Stump. It didn't get built. They built the first tier of it. Then the other reason I'm showing it is because it's a very English story. They built the first tier of it, then they ran out of money. Not only that, more importantly, they built it on marshland. So as soon as they built the first tier, it started to sink and lopside. So it was abandoned. Another tower at the same time was Blackpool Tower. Now, Blackpool Tower was built again by Victorian industrialists. Blackpool, before Blackpool Tower, was a seaside resort, but only a tiny one, like a fishing village almost. Well, not village, small town. It was connected by railways, as I'll go back to in a second. But the invention of the building of the town about 1896 made it this kind of enormous seaside resort, made it an enormous hub for capital. So not only did it generate lots of wealth, obviously, lots of money was spent there. It grew and grew and grew. It became the working class resort in the north. It became an enormous, if you'll forgive the kind of term, it became an enormous financial centre. It's hard to imagine Blackpool as a financial centre, but it became an enormous generator of wealth. Watkins, I forgot to say, was building his tower, not because he loved big towers, but because he too needed a tourist attraction, because he wanted to build an amusement park, a gigantic amusement park in Wembley that was connected by his own railway. Again, it's about this idea of creating a hub of wealth. I'm telling you all that because I believe this is what happened under New Labour, essentially. This is what happened with public art. I think that public art, I'm not alone in this thought, but public art was used by New Labour to attempt to generate wealth in areas that have become very poor under the Thatcher government. So, of course, the Angel of the North was built in Gateshead. It's the idea of trying to make a sense of place and trying to create kind of around the creative industries, trying to build positivity and industry. Lots of money was spent on this by the New Labour government. This is Temenos in Middlesbrough. Again, it's exactly the same thing. Now, there are, of course, lots and lots of arguments. This is what I'm showing you it. About this money could have been spent on hospitals. It could have been spent on infrastructure. It could have been spent on many other things. But it wasn't. The New Labour spent lots and lots of money in areas that were essentially post-industrial in many respects in order to try and regenerate them. It's all about regeneration. Public art, as it was deployed by New Labour, is all about regeneration. and it's also about prettifying things. I can't remember really why I put this slide in, except that it's so hideous. I just, I just saw it and I thought, I've got to have it, because it's like, this is possibly the worst example ever of public art. If public art is about finding somewhere crap and making it pretty, this hasn't worked, has it? Anyway, so with all this stuff I'm telling you, I then started making work about public art. I made a project where I imagined I'd been employed by the current, well, what was then the coalition government, but a Tory government employed me as a think tank to make public artworks in this gigantic public art scheme. The Tories don't want to carry on like New Labour did. Imagine this is all fantasy. They don't want to carry on like New Labour did. They're not prepared to spend millions on making huge monuments and statues. They're certainly not prepared to spend billions on creating an infrastructure for towns that are failing in the post-industrial north, but they do want something. So they employ me to come up with an idea, and I come up with this idea called A Balloon for Britain, in which I make 10 gigantic party balloons and float them across the 10 poorest cities in Britain. So this one's above Hull. So this is my solution to all Hull's problems. The bloke below is obviously enjoying it very much. And I made 10 of these. So this is obviously it's a satirical thing about how public art and it's about the gigantic nature of public art, but also about how money is spent on public art. This is over Sunderland. This is me rescuing Sunderland, and back to Blackpool again. This is Caerphilly, I think, in Wales, and then this is Dundee. That's a few of them. This is the whole set. This is 10. This is how I'd save Britain with 10 party balloons. So I got to thinking that if the actual real scheme, the real deployment of public art by New Labour, let's call it, just make it simple and say that, if that really worked, if by building gigantic monuments in depressed areas, that area could then financially and socially and in every other possible way be turned around, it could become successful, then perhaps that same policy could be deployed in Afghanistan. Perhaps if there was a scheme to put public art into Afghanistan, all Afghanistan's problems would go away. So I started to think about this. I started to think about how would this work? Well, what it would be like a kind of donation program. We'd take maybe the UN would do it, the United Nations would take sculptural donations from big artists, Anish Kapoor in this case, from around the world. They'd take this existing public art, in the same way that on Blue Peter you used to send 10p to save a dog or something. This was the same thing. You'd take things from piazzas in Chicago, and the people of Chicago would donate their public artwork. Now, this was a bit trite in the end. I thought, well, this is a bit silly. It's just a Photoshop joke. So what I'd really decided to do was think, how could this really work? What's the real story? And so I came up with this idea. It's about Anthony Gormley and Anish Kapoor, almost as kind of Bond-like figures. And it's about how they would then save Afghanistan with public artwork. So this is Afghanistan yesterday. This is what it was like. So I realize now I've been facing that way all the time. You probably couldn't hear me. This is what Afghanistan was like before the new United Nations scheme. This is the meeting. President Karzai meets the United Nations. He wants things. He's asking for things. Obama's trying to quickly wrap up the meeting. Obama's trying to fob him off with iPads. He's saying, what do you want? You want hospitals? No, you want iPads. He's trying to give him some iPads to solve all his problems. President Karzai rightly loses his temper and said he's sick of the Band-Aid solutions that the West are offering to fix Afghanistan. He wants the real deal. He wants the big hitters. He wants the unsayable solution. He wants Auntie Anish to come and rescue Afghanistan by building gigantic public sculptures across it. Because we know this works, because Middlesbrough, right? So, of course, now this is you might be able to see Stephen Fry there if you look carefully. So this is a drinking. So Anish and Anthony are in Piccadilly in their gentleman's club. They get the phone call. I must say that Anish is obviously in charge here because he's number one. Anthony Gormley is number two. Number three is Dave Cameron calls Anish and tells him this is the big one. At the United Nations meeting this morning, I secured the client, Afghanistan. I secured the budget, and more importantly, the permission from the boss, Obama. I've got you the commission you always wanted. Within hours, concrete, steel, equipment, bolts, nuts, bolts, everything, ideas, everything else you need to make public art is loaded onto national lottery-funded ships. There's an enormous fleet of aeroplanes flying from Europe and America to Afghanistan, dropping British Arts Council-sponsored bricks and things. I don't know, I never knew what was in there, cornflakes. Anyway, so all the equipment is delivered to Afghanistan. 24 hours later, Anish and Anthony finally arrive. They dispute territory. Of course, Helmand Province is the more glamorous and well-known part of Afghanistan, so obviously Anish wants that for himself. Anthony Gormley disputes this with Anthony. They kind of fall out. Anyway, work begins. So in order to build the new Afghanistan with their gigantic monuments, they have to first destroy everything, obviously. It goes on and on like this. I'm going to cut a little bit. Anyway, so there's an argument between Anthony and Anish, but it's a bit of a low-level argument. Anish, of course, has to build the tallest tower ever. So he builds one that I think is 2,500 kilometers or something like that, from Helmand Province straight out into space. While he's up there building his new and the tallest ever piece of artwork, monument, and a bit like a Bond villain, Anthony cuts him off and he floats out into space, meaning that Anthony Gormley now takes over Afghanistan. He's the new Lord Provost of Afghanistan. He's the king. And he's going to inflict his artwork onto Afghanistan. Now he's got rid of Anish. He builds hundreds of figures across Afghanistan. This is him unveiling one of them. And when it's unveiled, he causes absolute terror and fear amongst the locals because they'd never seen a man without a penis, or one so big, as it were. Eventually, things are calmed down by the president, and eventually calm is restored to Afghanistan. You know, there are hundreds of Anthony Gormley impressions of himself across Afghanistan. Eventually, of course, this brings order and wealth and peace. And Afghanistan is, at least temporarily, is brought to, it becomes incredibly, I'm not going to tell you the whole story because I want you to buy the book, but it becomes incredibly successful. It becomes a kind of hipster kind of place because in Afghanistan, they realize that these statues, these artworks have allowed them to sort of become a commercial enterprise. They start up industries. They start grinding their own coffee. They start having folk festivals that are internationally visited. They start making penny farthings and other fixed-wheel bicycles. And it becomes a kind of hipster kind of place, and it becomes very, 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 very successful. So much so that something terrible happens to it, but you've got to buy the book to find out what. But in reality, the point is this. I just had to put, there's another picture, I just saw it and I had to put it in. In reality, back to reality, what happened was, it didn't work out. These kind of huge monuments that were built, you know, the Temenos in Middlesbrough, Angel of North in Gateshead, this New Labour-sponsored scheme very openly and officially made this artwork in order to create industry. It didn't work out. I mean, the greatest disaster, I guess, and greatest non-disaster of the New Labour scheme to rebuild Britain through culture was the Dome at Greenwich. Obviously, it's always about building something big in somewhere really crap. So this was built on the peninsula in Greenwich, and it's all wasteland. And I just put this in because I just thought it's kind of, this is obviously Tony Blair Prescott, is that Ronnie Corbett perhaps, who's somehow snuck into the... So Ronnie's maybe some kind of cultural sort of minister that we didn't know about. Anyway, so I'm just going to show you quickly some things because really what I'm trying to get to is that the grand, the huge, the enormous sculptural solution didn't work. It didn't spread beyond itself. And that was already there in history. If you look at Blackpool today, as I say, it's the second poorest town in Britain. I was in Blackpool in late 2013 by myself, which is never a good idea. And I was bored, obviously. And I'd gone there to interview a band called Sleazenation, which everybody probably knows now, but they were very little known then. And the band were late turning up. They were actually a day late, or I was a day early. And I'm by myself, and I was wandering around Blackpool, and I was writing this article for Arena Home Plus magazine. And I was trying to, I'd go into this thing with Arena where I'd sort of do all the photographs myself, and I'd write everything myself and design it myself. So it's almost like a fanzine within their magazine. And I was trying to take photographs of Blackpool. And of course, my photographs, there were pictures that were sort of like, spew on the pavements. There were really decrepit chip shops. Sad neon that's broken and all that. It was the kind of the very cliched northern misery. They were actually like Morrissey's holiday snaps, what it looked like when I'd finished. So they'd really, really crap photographs. So I needed to come up with a solution when I was there to sort of, an objective way to photograph the misery. And what I thought was a great idea. It dawned on me that if I photographed the tower every time and kept the tower the same size, And I walked around Blackpool in a semicircle from one shoreline around the back of the town, through the town, to the north shore. Then, as long as I was trying to keep the tower the same size in the same place in the frame every time I took a photograph, I was being objective. I wasn't looking for sort of spew on the pavement or, drunks in doorways. I was just photographing what was there because all I wanted was every time the tower became visible in this half circle, I would photograph it. So that's what I did. I can't remember why I'm telling you all this now. Oh yeah, big towers don't work. So, really, this tower's been there since 1896 or thereabouts. It's really not worked. I'm just showing this really because just about the kind of idea of monumentalism, tourist attractions, and how they don't, the wealth or the hub that they once created, it doesn't spread and it doesn't last forever because, of course, Blackpool was very successful probably up until about the 50s, the 60s, until package holidays and people going to Spain and Greece started to undermine its basic premise. Okay, so on a further note about the monumental not working. So we've actually reached officially, I think, and very symbolically recently, there's something very symbolic recently, we've actually reached an end of enormous public artworks being made. There's no way the coalition government that we just had would ever have paid millions of pounds into the arts to make these things for any reason. The Tory government that we've got now, even less so. It just won't happen. But of course, public art will exist still, and I think it's very telling and very symbolic that recently, a few weeks ago, that the group Assemble were nominated for the Turner Prize. And it's the first time any designers, as far as I know, have been nominated for the Turner Prize. But it's also very telling about what's happened to public art. This image, for me, I'll just quickly about this image. This image, it's called Vive La Mort. It's Long Live Death. And I imagine this is a kind of future government almost. This is like a future Tory government, perhaps, that have decided that the Angel of the North is wasted on the North, and they brought it back. Because they paid for it, and they say it's theirs. They bring it back and put it in Trafalgar Square. But back to the other point I was making. So this street isn't going to win the Turner Prize, definitely. This one might do. So there's these two streets in Toxteth, and the Granby Four Streets project by Assemble, which is essentially where this group Assemble from London have aided these residents in Toxteth around this Granby area to really regenerate their own space. So that there are actually farmers markets there. There's going to be an open air kind of almost like botanical garden. There are lots of things. I'm very reluctant to be cynical about that because it's too complicated for now, for me to go through now. Also, I'm not sure if I'm right if I was cynical about it, but let's just say it's happening. My great fear for the people of Toxteth is this. Without trying to be too grand or outdo myself, we have reached a point where cities are over, I think. There's this kind of whole, you don't have to look at Joanna Lumley and her insane bridge, this kind of garden bridge that she needs to build. It becomes quite symbolic about the end of cities. Cities were built, essentially, industrial cities in this country were built, again, they were Victorian inventions because that's where industry was. That's why they existed. Now we don't necessarily need cities. This is why everybody is kind of dressing up in kind of Edwardian clothing, riding bicycles and looking for allotments because the idea of this 20th century city is kind of gone. The problem with the Mumfordization of areas, which could happen here eventually, right? It does happen. It's always surprising, it does happen, is that you get these people coming along, right? Now they come along, once it's a bit safer, once all the bad people have definitely been removed, these sort of people come along, and they sell you bowls of cereal for £4.50. And they've got 87 different cereals, and let's just not talk about them, but they are. So anyway, so I'm showing you this, and this, because I have a future fantasy, and it is this, that if the Evening Standard can identify and make a cover saying the hipster is dead, which they did a month ago, then that's a clear sort of bell, a clear sign that the hipster isn't dead, but the hipster will be incorporated into state policy somehow. Now it's time for it to be used. And I have this future fantasy where a minister comes along behind David Cameron, who's minding his own business, mixing possibly NWA with the Smiths at 10 Downing Street. The minister tells him he's got this great idea. It didn't work up north. It didn't work in Middlesbrough building Temenos, building this huge sculpture. It didn't work building the Angel of the North. It's still poor there. People are still not necessarily voting Tory. It's not worked. They're not coming under the wing of us. How do we win this once working class, now often post-industrial area? How do we win them over? The minister has an idea. what they should do is get a hipster army together, a hipster militia, led by William Hague. And William Hague and his hipster militia will invade the north. I think I'll leave it at that, actually.